Life's an adventure. Share the journey. Introducing Yamaha's latest terrain-conquering side-by-side that combines thrilling power with maximum comfort and versatility. The all-new Wolverine R-Max 41000. It's an off-road game-changer. Check it out now at YamahaMotorsports.com and see your local Yamaha dealer today. Always protect the environment and wear your seatbelt, helmet, eye protection, and protective clothing. Read the owner's manual and product warning labels before operation.
This episode is made possible by PwC.
When unprecedented times are all the time, it's time to start walking the talk. Leaders like you turn to PwC to see and stay ahead. Upskill your workforce, use intelligent automation, and transform big ideas into breakthrough outcomes. Explore the human-led, tech-powered solutions that help you thrive. It's all part of PwC.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Hey guys, welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com. Every episode in audio and video, exclusive video highlights, the latest rock book releases. A recent rock book release is The Name of This Band is R.E.M, a Biography by Peter Ames Carlin. Peter's a first-time guest to the podcast. So much I want to know about R.E.M, and it does not get better than this book. Peter looks beyond the sex, drugs, and rock and roll to open a window into the fascinating lives of four college friends, Michael Stipe, Peter Buck, Mike Mills, and Bill Berry, who stuck together at any cost until the end. I put together a playlist of R.E.M. You can find it in this episode's show notes. But right now, here is Peter Ames Carlin. Peter, thanks so much for coming on to talk about the book.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Where are you checking in from, by the way?
I am in Seattle, Washington.
Ah, Seattle. Very cool. Okay. You started working on the book at the start of COVID, spring of 2020, and you write, quote, "The ensuing months and then years of near solitude were rough, but also clarifying." Can you expand on that? And what was the process like for you writing this book?
Well, at first it sort of wove in magically with the demands of COVID, because starting any project, you always end up spending a lot of time just doing research on the computer and digging through archives and figuring out, what exists in terms of the published media, ordering books and doing that kind of stuff and reaching out to folks and maybe starting to do some phone or Zoom emails. And so for the first, 6 or 9 months, it's just the usual sort of solitary building up of the your information base. And then after that, it began to become a limiting factor, because that's when I start traveling and meeting people and interviewing them. And I couldn't do any of that, let alone, go to see shows or see music or have anybody, coming through town. And so it kind of slowed me down for a while, but eventually, it began, obviously as the restrictions began to loosen and the vaccine came into play, then I could travel back to Athens and start to hang out with people and talk to them. And the other thing is, it just sort of allowed me to remember, as I was reading about their earliest days and just sort of how important the Athens community was, and just, the ritual of going to a show and meeting people and seeing music and communing with folks with similar tastes and cultural sensibilities. It was like, God, I miss that. And it just allowed me to sort of think about the experience that they had had and what it was that really merged them with their audience in those early days. And so that became, something that I really began to think about and try to start writing about at the time.
How much of a fan are you of the band?
Well, I had become a huge fan of the band. It was almost impossible to not be in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, especially if you had, if you were interested in rock and roll, if you were interested in kind of the larger sort of, social, political possibilities of rock and roll. I mean, one of the things that made R.E.M. so engaging and so bracing to follow and listen to as they sort of went through their biggest days, from really the late 80s until the late 90s, was how they really seemed to be a part of this wave of kind of progressive politics and idealism that was sweeping across the planet, at the same time as they were really coming into their own. There was the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s. There was the fall of apartheid in South Africa. And then the election of Bill Clinton and this kind of rise of at least some tentative progressivism in the US. And they were, kind of came hand in hand in that, because their music and sort of the way that independent music suddenly became part of the mainstream in the late 80s, through in a lot of ways what REM was doing, was really sort of encapsulated by the experience of seeing this band that had been a cult band and a college band and a nightclub band for so long suddenly become kind of the toast of the town, and really, in the early 90s, go from being a band that, a lot of people had heard on the radio and sort of knew of and kind of would maybe sing along with or turn up the radio when The One I Love or Stand came on the radio, to becoming kind of a national sort of rallying point in a sense. By the time the album Out of Time came out in 1991 and the single Losing My Religion became such a smash hit, they were ubiquitous. You couldn't turn on the radio without hearing their songs. You couldn't turn on MTV without seeing their videos. And sort of, it wasn't just the sound of REM, but kind of the idea of REM as these kind of college kids, smart, sensitive, cool guys who ran, not only sang about progressive ideals, but then, the more you read about them, the more you came to understand that they ran their office that way too. They were so about recycling their garbage out of a lot of what they did there and the issues they spoke up about and the way that they communicated that stuff went hand in hand with the music. And it just became a part of what felt like a very sort of exciting, youthful, idealistic moment in popular music.
And you talk about them being ubiquitous. That's why, for me, when it ended, and it ended so quietly, without much fanfare, I just remember being bummed, a little bummed, because I thought, well, there goes really one of the greatest American rock and roll bands of all time. And it's just kind of came and went, no farewell tour. And we can get into a little bit of that as we move, throughout this. But I remember, like I said, just being a little bummed. Listening to their music the last few days, getting ready for the interview, I just think there's just so many great songs, and they could have done like a U2, like Residency at the Sphere. They could have done something like that, or the Rolling Stones. But as I find from reading the book, it's really more of what they didn't do as much as what they did do. So they kind of went against what you would expect. And Michael Stipe too. I always thought of him as being reluctantly famous, but he did want to be famous. I mean, he was outspoken as a kid too. What were his childhood years like? He moved around, I know, quite a bit, right? Military family?
Exactly. His dad was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, was in Vietnam and pulled hazardous duty there for flying recon helicopters. So it was like daily dogfights, essentially, over the skies of Vietnam. And the family, bounced around to various military bases. And eventually, for, the bulk of Michael's childhood and adolescence, ended up in a suburb of St. Louis, where his dad was working at the military base and, the kids were going to school. It made the family very close, and Michael was and remains very close to his sisters and to his mother. His father passed away some time ago, but they were a very close family. And all the kids were artistic, and Michael was particularly so, and very interested in visual art, extremely interested in music, rock and roll. And by the time he was halfway through high school, was really fixed on this idea of becoming a rock star, essentially. And he had a very close friend, this young woman, and they would hang out together and listen to records and dress in rock and roll singer type clothes and fantasized about this idea of which one of them was going to be in Rolling Stone first. The other thing that's interesting is that his dad, for all that he was a military guy and an officer and career military, and one of Michael's childhood friends said that he never saw Mr. Stipe when he wasn't wearing a flight suit, and wore a cavalry hat like some of the people in the Army aviation units did. But he was also very soft-spoken and very kind and sensitive to his kids. And his friend Melanie remembered once they used to dress up and go to the Rocky Horror Picture Show screenings, where people would dress in drag, and Michael would dress as Dr. Frankenfurter, with the full lace stockings and leather bustier and mascara and heavy rouge and everything, just completely in drag. And his friend remembered that they got dressed up in Michael's room and were walking through the living room to go out and go see that night screening. And his dad, Lieutenant Colonel Stipe, sitting reading his newspaper, and he glimpses over his paper and he sees his son dressed as a woman walking out, and he goes, "Michael, are you going out like that?" And Michael said, "Yeah." And his dad goes, "Okay, have a good night." It's just like, great, have fun. Whereas you would expect that the lieutenant colonel helicopter flying dad is going to freak out, but that's not how it was, and I think given that foundation of really unconditional love and support from his family, it gave him the wherewithal and the emotional foundation to become like a huge rock star without losing himself, and I think all the guys in that band had similarly supportive families and came into that high pressure career of being rock stars, and global celebrities with a sense of themselves, that allowed them to not get carried away by the dark stuff.
Yeah, well, then we can get into, I mean, I always think of the lyric, "That's me in the spotlight losing my religion." To me, that's just selling your soul, which is something they did not do.
That's not necessarily.
We could get
that's
into.
That's not Michael's, and I mean that's an old Southern colloquialism, which just basically means like losing your shit. I mean, just going bananas. It's like, I can't believe this. It's that's the feeling in that song. It's not selling out. It's just losing your sense of yourself. Like, oh my goodness, that's kind of what that's about.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Be right back with a snack, Jack. Don't go away.
Life's an adventure. Share the journey. Introducing Yamaha's latest terrain-conquering side-by-side that combines thrilling power with maximum comfort and versatility. The all-new Wolverine R-Max 41000. It's an off-road game changer. Check it out now at YamahaMotorsports.com and see your local Yamaha dealer today. Always protect the environment and wear your seatbelt, helmet, eye protection, and protective clothing. Read the owner's manual and product warning labels before operation.
This episode is made possible by PwC.
A robot may not be coming for your job, but competitors are coming for your market share. At PwC, we pair the right tech with the right solutions to help you gain a competitive edge. Reimagine operations from the cloud, fuel innovation with responsible AI, and detect risks before they become headlines. That's human-led and tech-powered. It's all part of PwC.
Patti Smith's 1975 album, Horses, that was a watershed moment for Michael. What was it about that album and specifically in that song Birdland that resonated with him so much?
Well, he had always been drawn toward, he had an interesting sort of paradoxical taste in music. So, as a little kid, he really loved like the Monkees and the Archies and that kind of disposable pop stuff. Like, I think he loved the sense of fun that, those kind of novelty songs or slightly novelty-esque bands could bring to music. But on the other hand, he was also drawn to art, serious art and avant-garde art. And I think, and the idea of punk music and punk music itself and that kind of immediacy and expression and the visceral power of it really appealed to him as well. And so hearing Patti Smith and seeing how she could take really raw, visceral music and pair it to really sophisticated literary caliber poetry was really moving and, and influential for Michael. He completely resonated with that album the moment that he heard it and immediately began insisting all of his friends come and listen to it. And not all of them got it on the level that he did because they were all AOR album rock kids of the mid 70s, So they're listening to all that stuff, Blue Oyster Cult and Ted Nugent and Southern Rock and all that stuff. And so Michael suddenly being into this kind of art punk songstress was like, where'd this come from? But that was hugely influential for him. Birdland was a song that he's talked about. That's one of the, sort of the epic works on that album. And it's based on, I think, a story written by, is it Eric Reich, who was the son of Wilhelm Reich, who was writing about the loss, his grief for the loss of his father, and him imagining his father coming out of, his late father appearing to him on a spaceship, and him begging his father to let him go with him on the spaceship. And when I think about the idea of a dead father coming to connect with his son and the son wishing to fly away with him, it brought to mind, certainly to me, thinking about Michael's connection to it, the fact that he had spent those years as a kid knowing that his father was flying in a helicopter in extremely dangerous airspace. And, you never know how a child internalizes that kind of risk and fear, and understanding that on any given day, his dad could be killed. And so that, in my sort of perhaps amateur analyzing, it seemed like his deep connection to that song and his experience as a child sounded connected to me.
He met Peter Buck at a record store. Peter was, I think, working at the record store. But you could talk about how the four guys end up meeting.
Well, they were all in Athens, Georgia, which is a small college town, the home of the University of Georgia in the northeast corner of the state. And Peter had studied earlier and then dropped out of Emory University in Atlanta. He came from the suburbs of Atlanta. And the other guys, Bill and Mike, came from Macon, Georgia. And those two, the bassist and the drummer in the band, Bill Berry and Mike Mills, they'd grown up in the same neighborhood and become buddies and played in a bands together, Bill, obviously the drummer, and Mike, the bassist. And Mike was a very trained musician who could handle keyboards and guitar, but took up the bass, really loved playing the bass. And he and Bill had a natural connection, and as well as being good friends, they had a good musical connection. And they goofed around after high school in Macon for a year or so, and then decided to go to school and packed up their instruments sort of with the idea that maybe they'd find some like-minded guys to jam with. And they got to Athens, and Michael's family, his dad had retired from the military, and they had moved to a town not very far away from Athens. And they had assumed that when Michael graduated high school, he was going to go down there and study at the university. And for the first half a year, Michael stayed up in the suburbs of St. Louis because that's where his friends were, and he wasn't sure he wanted to move south. But eventually he ran out of money, so he moved back down, and he started studying at the art school. And Peter was working at this Wuxtree music, record store in Athens. And Michael came to the store, which was one of those places that had tons of used records and imports, and discovered they had all these punk and art music imports from New York and LA and London and Paris and Germany, and was completely blown away by this, and started talking to the clerk, who turned out to be Peter. And Peter had such an encyclopedic knowledge of all of pop music, as he had grown up, again, in the suburbs of Atlanta. Very, very smart, constant reader who read everything he could get his hands on, and was extremely interested in records and pop music, and was teaching himself how to play guitar. So it turned out that, Michael had sung in some cover bands, and Peter had been playing guitar nonstop since he was a teenager. And they just decided to get together and jam and see what they could come up with. And they were sort of just beginning to do that when a friend of theirs, who also knew Bill and Mike, said, I think the four of you guys would get along really well. So they thought, okay, and they met these guys at a party, and then they all got together to jam. And really, the way everyone described it, from the first time they got together, it was like, oh, we've got something here, like this, a natural connection. And that was in the winter of 1980, and they just kept playing together, and then started, writing songs together. And then when their mutual friend was having a birthday party in early April, she convinced them to make their debut as a performing band at the party, which they did with no small amount of stage fright and pre-show nerves. But they got up there and they played to this church full of kids. And, by all accounts, it was a really striking debut.
St. Mary's Church, right? St. Mary's Church.
Yeah. It was a closed Episcopalian church on the edge of downtown Athens that someone had turned into apartments.
Built in the 1860s, and then it was a Red Cross.
But it had been built by a guy that owned a cotton mill or something, and he wanted his workers to have a church, But then when the mill shut down, then there was no need for the church. So it got basically closed and turned into a variety of other types of housing for the local Red Cross, and then maybe there was a local museum or something in there.
Yes.
But then this guy decided to turn it into and built these weird modular apartments in there, and that's where college kids could live amid their own filth. And
Yeah, I'm trying to picture that in my mind too. But also, what was the room in the back was perfect to play music there, like the acoustics. There was something about
it was the old, most of the old sanctuary.
Right.
So that was where the altar was and where the pews had been. And, there was the steeple that came up, but the steeple had rotted out a little bit. So water, rain had been pouring in. So it was a little musty back there. But it was a great place to go with great acoustics for your band, and you could set up on the altar and your band could rehearse, or there could be a party. And then there was a natural stage there, which was only slightly rotted out from the rainwater that had been coming down. And so it was their friend Kathleen O'Brien, and it was her birthday party. And so a couple bands debuted. One was, I think, the Side Effects, which was another band of college kids. And then the band that weren't quite called R.E.M. yet, I think they called themselves the Twisted Kites that night. But they knew that was just a placeholder name. And they came out, and it was like, one of the interesting things about Athens and the music scene was how many bands came out of the art department there, the Lamar Dodd School of Art at the University of Georgia, because the professors there, the art teachers, many of them were practicing artists who were very bohemian and avant-garde in their tastes and ideals. And they essentially had already figured out that their interests in folk culture and in avant-garde art were also coming through in punk music. This sort of post-slick rock and roll, this really sort of stripped down grungy rock and roll. And the idea that you shouldn't need to be a great musician to form a band, just figure out what type of band you want to be, see what instrument you can learn, get together with some friends, and then you all can be a band. And that's exactly how the B-52s had come together a couple of years earlier. And it was how R.E.M. came together, and like Pylon, Love Tractor, the Side Effects, the Method Actors, just band after band after band. And they all sort of came up through this sense of possibility that you could be an artist and make really artistically creative music without necessarily being like Eric Clapton on the guitar.
There's a song, Gardening at Night, that's important. I think that's where all four, as far as songwriting is concerned, they all four really kind of lock in together.
There was a whole, very early on, I mean, really within the first few weeks of their first performance, and, that spring and early summer of 1980, they began composing songs and coming up with things like Gardening at Night and Don't Go Back to Rockville, and a lot of those classic early songs. And there was a really cool sort of, the chemistry that they brought to it together with all their sort of diverse influences was really interesting. And because Peter was, he had played a lot of guitar, but he was not like schooled per se. He taught himself how to play by listening to, hearing records on the radio or playing them on the stereo and just figuring out how to play the chords. And so he came up with a very sort of unique way of playing. He did a lot of, articulated the chords, a lot of sort of hanging chords. And Mike Mills, who was the most trained of all the musicians playing bass, had a lot of room to expand on his bass lines and to come up with really melodic stuff that he could play up and down the neck of his instrument. And meanwhile, Michael was, an unschooled poet, but obviously had a really strong sense of the possibilities of lyric writing and liked to write in a very kind of abstract, kind of impressionistic way, and created these lyrics that were very, even though, if you wrote the lyrics down, the sentences might not parse, in the sense of declarative sentences. There was the language that he used. He was very conscious of the texture of the language. He was very conscious with how words fit together and how syllables worked, especially since they mixed the vocals so low at first and really had this idea that the vocal should be just another texture in the music. It's just another instrument, just like the guitar and the bass and the drums. Once you could work out what he was saying, which you would have to do on your own because they also wouldn't wouldn't ever publish lyric sheets at first. You had to really, he left a lot of room for interpretation in his lyrics. Let's put it that way.
Gardening at night, it's never where. And you say, where
yeah,
exactly?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's not, and it's just kind of like, a lot of what he says in those, particularly in those early lyrics, are almost like half statements and weird images that kind of come rattling out that don't necessarily make literal sense. But when you think about them in the context of the feeling of the music, you sort of begin to intuit things about what he's saying. It resonates with the fact that the band was called R.E.M, which stands for rapid eye movement, which describes the level of sleep where your subconscious is most active and you're dreaming and you're having that, living in that kind of dream reality. And you could say, like, well, that's obvious because their songs were so dreamy. But, Michael has always insisted that he had no idea what it meant when he pulled it out of the dictionary. He just liked the fact that there were initials and that they had periods between them. And it just seemed unique to him and also impossible to pigeonhole as a band name, which is why they fixed on it and stuck with it.
He had to have been a big reader, or is, I'm sure, still, like Peter, right?
Well, to a certain extent, yeah. I'm sure. Michael's a very intelligent guy, and he's very, he's very sophisticated. But I don't know. I don't know that anyone reads as much as Peter Buck does.
Yeah.
You talk about guy. He's constantly never without a book. And kids that he went to high school with talk about like, well, he'd be in class just bored out of his wits because the teachers were idiots, and so he would sit there with his own book, sort of in the textbook, and just be reading whatever he brought with him. But he was one of these guys that didn't have to pay attention in class, but in order to ace the test. And at the spring of his senior year, there was a rumor that started, which may or may not be true. Peter swears it isn't, that he had the highest SAT scores of anyone in Georgia that year. Yeah. Peter says, no, that's nonsense. That's not true. but just the fact that people believed it sort of tells you something about how smart that kid was.
But one thing he did work hard at was the guitar. Right, you talked about he was practicing very hard constantly.
Yeah,
it made it look easy, but
when you work really hard at something, it looks effortless, right? But there's an inverse proportional relationship between the amount of labor you put into something and how easy it looks, after you've achieved it. So he was very interested in learning how to play, these very sort of complicated chords and lines, and coming up with distinctive ways to play. So he's not the guy that's gonna improvise a big solo, he's not a rock guitarist in the way that like your Eric Clapton or your Jeff Beck or the Eddie Van Halen were. He has his own, and not because he can't do it, he just doesn't care to. I'm sure he, when you think about the moments in the R.E.M. catalog where he's playing a guitar solo, like in the One I Love, say, it's 4 notes, but it's a minimalism that is so powerful. More notes than that, I think would be worse. And so it was the fact that the way they put their instruments together was so distinctive from how other bands did it. And to an extent, they used their actual, to some extent, limitations and turned them into huge assets just by being so distinctive.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I will return. You shall see. I will be back.
Life's an adventure. Share the journey. Introducing Yamaha's latest terrain-conquering side-by-side that combines thrilling power with maximum comfort and versatility. The all-new Wolverine R-Max 41000. It's an off-road game-changer. Check it out now at YamahaMotorsports.com and see your local Yamaha dealer today. Always protect the environment and wear your seatbelt, helmet, eye protection, and protective clothing. Read the owner's manual and product warning labels before operation.
This episode is made possible by PwC.
A robot may not be coming for your job, but competitors are coming for your market share. At PwC, we pair the right tech with the right solutions to help you gain a competitive edge. Reimagine operations from the cloud, fuel innovation with responsible AI, and detect risks before they become headlines. That's human-led and tech-powered. It's all part of PwC.
They could have signed to RCA, but they favored IRS and they ended up signing with them. Talk about why they ended up going with them instead of RCA or any other label.
The RCA deal, I think, was super tentative. It was a real low ball type of thing. And it was even like, well, you can make an EP and we'll see how that does. And if that does well, then we'll pick up this option and you can make, an album or two or something like that. Whereas IRS, which was an indie label, though it was an indie label with pretty big, that already had hits, I think with the Go-Go's by then and one or two others. In a sense, it was like they signed a smaller deal. They negotiated smaller advances in exchange for more artistic control. So the idea was that they were going to invest in their own music and their own sense of how they should pursue the music and pursue the work in order to avoid any kind of sort of corporate executive decision making or authority coming in and saying, no, you're going to have to do this to make it more radio friendly. You're going to have to do that. You're going to have to make this video this exact way. So the idea was, okay, we believe enough in the work that we're doing and how we're doing it that we're going to take less money up front in order to make the records that we want to make. And it turned out to be a great wager for everybody because they kept making these distinctive albums that flowed only from their own taste and their own sensibility. But each one really, for the first 15, 16 years of their career, every record they made was bigger than the record before it. And every tour they played to more people than the one before it. And just step after step after step after step. And so they began, even their early EP, the first EP, Chronic Town, sold like 50,000 copies or something, which was for a small indie college band from a small indie college town on an indie label. It got a lot of attention, and that's a lot of sales for something like that. And then their first album, Murmur, came out in '83, and it sold in the low six figures, but was also such a critical smash that when Rolling Stone had their year-end album of the year, the artist of the year type poll, the critics proclaimed, in the same year that Thriller came out, in the same year that U2's, I think is it War came out?
I think that was 83. Yeah.
Yeah. Like huge albums, like epic albums. They named Murmur the album of the year, which was like a huge deal. This was a band, it was their first record, it's this weird, murky, arty record. It got so much attention. And so, of course, the next album, Reckoning, came out in '84 and sold way better than that one. And by '86, they were going gold. And by '87, Document went platinum. And it was, and then Green went multi-platinum. And then, Out of Time, and then Automatic for the People, and then Monster were like 10 plus million selling
record-setting deal with Warner Brothers, I remember, in the mid-90s. Yeah, even as the band ascended, though, they were, like you say, they beelined to campuses. They did college radio interviews. Why do you think R.E.M's music connected so strongly with college kids?
I think because when they began making it, they were college kids or college kid age, certainly. And one of the things that they understood, not only, from the very beginning, was that they were going to play everywhere that they could possibly get booked. They were not going to be selective at all about where they were going to play or who they were going to play to. So from the beginning, they were kids who were clearly not frat guys. They were not that type of guys, but they would play fraternity parties. They would play sorority parties. They would play pizza parlors. They would play gay bars. They would play anywhere that had a new wave night, go in there, play their songs, start to meet people. And they were very welcoming to and very collegial with their fans, because I think what they understood, it was, not just their fans, but the people who worked at college radio, that these kids who spun records on college radio and were drawn to that scene or drawn to their music were essentially the same type of people who they would have been friends with had these kids gone to school in Athens, or if they were going to school in, Madison, Wisconsin, or wherever, up in Boston. It's like they would come to town, go to the college radio station, hang out with those people, get to know them, figure out like what parts of town they might want to go to hang out in. And they would end up connecting with these folks, and they'd become friends, and they'd start, as they would cycle through towns, they could come into any town and recognize a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen folks that they had hung out with before, and invite them to the show and then get invited to parties. And then it was this kind of building this big foundation of fans and followers and supporters, like on a personal basis. And that became a very strong fan base. And all those people began to drag in their friends. And then those friends brought friends. And it just grew and grew and grew along those lines in a very just sort of retail hand to hand to hand way. And I think that accounted for a lot of, the strength of that audience, and just how much it grew, sort of getting them to a place where they could start thinking about making records that were going to get played on mainstream radio.
So you think that set them up? Because there was a question, did you note in the book, reporters were asking, would success spoil R.E.M.? Because as they make that climb, and you go through the years, 84, South Central Rain, I'm Sorry, and Don't Go Back to Rockville, do okay. Fables of the Reconstruction from 85 has Driver 8 on there. Good songs, no huge hits. But then in 88, Document, the album, the one I love, is huge. That's a number 10 single. It's the End of the World as We Know It. Now we're starting to see the big success come. So did that help them? Were they spoiled by that type of success? It doesn't seem like it.
They were very girded for success in a lot of ways. I mean, both because of the many years that they spent on the road, living out of each other's pockets, essentially, as they were driving in the van from place to place to place, and they were very good friends when they began. And they just managed to pursue their career in a way where they really prioritize their relationship and maintaining good, warm, clear dialogue about everything that was going on. And they had also, due in large part to Peter Buck's reading of the rock and roll literature, had sort of come to understand that the two things that always break up bands are fights over credit and fights over royalties. So in order to diffuse every fight before it began, he said, what we really need to do is just agree ahead of time that everything that we write and everything that we record that's an original song is going to be credited to all four of us, and all four of us are going to profit accordingly. So there was no disagreement ever about, wait a minute, I wrote more of that song than you did, or you didn't write that, or blah, 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 blah. So they went into their career and having resolved the worst possible conflicts before they could even have a conflict over them. And I think also, the fact that they took them so long to break through on that level meant that they could really establish what their chemistry was. They really could really value one another's contributions and one another's humanity on a level where the depth of their friendship and their feelings for each other was always going to be deeper than their connection to wealth and fame and the spotlight and all that. There was never I've heard from a variety of people who produce them that alone among the bands and artists that they'd ever worked with, the guys in R.E.M. were always individually arguing that their part should be reduced in the mix. Nobody ever got into that thing of like, well, I'm the star. Like that happens all the time, right? Except they were a band where everyone was like, something, we should turn me down a little, which is not a conversation people have.
Peter Ames Carlin, he's the author of The Name of This Band is R.E.M, a biography. By the way, the title, that comes from, Michael would say that in concert, right? The name of this band is R.E.M.
It's interesting because after the book came out, Chris Franz, who's the drummer for the Talking Heads, posted something on Facebook like, what the hell is this? Because, there's that Talking Heads record. The name of this band is Talking Heads. And frankly, it's like, I've always admired the Talking Heads and a lot of their songs, I love a lot. But I was never so conversant with their career that like I could name like half a dozen Talking Heads records, but that wasn't one of them. So it was like, and when that happened, and like then some Talking Heads fans were like, hey, this is a ripoff. And I was like, A, no, it's not. And B, if I was going to rip something off, it's like, I don't know if that's the thing I would do, I mean, it was like, it was just, Michael used to say, it was like in the second half of their career, he would start shows. They'd come out on stage and the audience would go crazy. And he would say, before they played a note, he'd say, the name of this band is R.E.M. and this is what we do. And then boom, right into, 2.5 hours of fantastic R.E.M. songs. So it was kind of like pretty groovy. And then when they just played, they did the one four-way reunion that they've ever done since they broke up, where they were being inducted just this last June in the Songwriters Hall of Fame, which was very meaningful for all those guys.
Sure.
They took their songwriting very seriously, and it was a huge, huge deal for them. So they decided that this is the one time, at the induction ceremony where they were actually the four of them going to get together and play one of their songs. And they came out on stage and everyone's going nuts because who thought this was going to happen? And Michael prefaced it by saying, the name of this band was R.E.M. and this is what we did. And then they played Losing My Religion. And I thought that was really sweet.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I gotta go now, but don't you leave town, huh?
Life's an adventure. Share the journey. Introducing Yamaha's latest terrain-conquering side-by-side that combines thrilling power with maximum comfort and versatility. The all-new Wolverine R-Max 41000. It's an off-road game-changer. Check it out now at YamahaMotorsports.com and see your local Yamaha dealer today. Always protect the environment and wear your seatbelt, helmet, eye protection, and protective clothing. Read the owner's manual and product warning labels before operation.
This episode is made possible by PwC.
When unprecedented times are all the time, it's time to start walking the talk. Leaders like you turn to PwC to see and stay ahead. Upskill your workforce, use intelligent automation, and transform big ideas into breakthrough outcomes. Explore the human-led, tech-powered solutions that help you thrive. It's all part of PwC.
The contract ended with IRS, right? They had it was a 5-record deal or whatever, 82 to 88, right? So now IRS wanted to keep REM and they tried, but REM, of course, they met with all the big labels. Warner Brothers ends up winning out. Why did Warner Brothers end up getting REM on their roster? What did they have that other labels didn't?
They had a long-standing track record as being the major label that was the most sympathetic toward artists and gave artists the most leeway to do whatever they felt like doing. It's not a coincidence that the book I did before the REM book was called Sonic Boom, and it was a history of Warner Brothers Records. And so I got to know those guys who had worked at Warner's, and it was, and that was a really cool book for me. I really enjoyed doing it and getting to know those guys because they had, the guy that was the chairman of the company, Mo Austin, and the fellow who was first a record producer, A&R man, who became the president of the company, Lenny Waronker, were uniquely, as well as Joe Smith, who was the president of Warner Brothers. They were sort of Warner Reprise were these connected labels at first. But they all shared the sensibility of understanding as the sort of the hippie era was beginning that this old corporate way of making pop records and running a record company where essentially there was this understanding that this is disposable music for teeny boppers and it didn't necessarily need to be good. It just needed to be flashy and to, that was ending. And that what was happening was that music was becoming, rock and roll music was becoming more artistic and more substantive. And in order to follow where the audience was they knew was going to go, they signed all these weird edgy artists like Joni Mitchell and Van Morrison and Jimi Hendrix and the Grateful Dead and Neil Young, and said, make the records that you want to make, because we're executives, like what your audience is going to want because that's what you want. And so they just gave these artists the as much room as they needed to make whatever records they wanted to make. And then the punchline was the record, as a result of loosening their authority over these artists, they became way more successful than the label had ever been, and very quickly became one of the most successful, influential, powerful record companies in the world. And one of the things they developed along the way was this incredibly powerful distribution network that had distribution all around the world. And one of the things that IRS lacked, even though they had hit records, was a strong distribution network overseas. And REM would get very frustrated in the 80s because they would go tour and go play these major cities in Europe. and like play to these small audiences because they would go to the record stores and they couldn't find their own records, because IRS was having a hard time getting them placed in, in all these stores and doing the publicity and all that stuff that was important. And so, along with being, sophisticated individualistic artists, they also wanted their music to be heard. And what they understood was if they signed with Warner's, they would sort of get the best of both worlds. They were going to make the records they felt like making. They were going to have artistic control over the music and also over, everything about, the album, the design of the covers, the videos they were going to make. They were going to make the call, which was the Warner Brothers sensibility anyway. So they were going to get that along with this global, powerful distribution network that was going to allow them, once they made these records and got them out, were going to be everywhere. And lo and behold, once their records came out on Warner, they began to sell, double, 3 times, 10 times what they'd been selling with IRS.
Yeah, the timing too, because R.E.M's, they're at the peak of their powers at that time, right? 5-album contract. That's the deal that they get with Warner Brothers, and boy, they gave them their money's worth. A phenomenal run. Just to
they signed 2 deals with Warner's. I think the first one was estimated to be somewhere between like $8 and $10 million for, and that's, and even then, you're talking in some ways about, their aspirational figures. It's like you could make as much as this if you hit these sales figures. If your record sells X number, then you could make this much. And it became even more when they re-signed with them in, I think, 96.
Was it 96? I was going to say
96 or 97. Yeah, I think it was 96.
Right. That was the record-setting deal. That was
that was
the Guinness
like
book or whatever.
80 million or, rumored or written, estimated to be about $80 million. But again, that depends on hitting certain sales numbers. It was going to be, no matter what, it was going to be a lot of money. But on the other hand, they had earned a ton of money. The 8 or 10 million that they were paid in, whatever the advances for the first 5 records was dwarfed by the amount of income that they made off of back to back to back, 10 million plus selling albums.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Hold on.
Life's an adventure. Share the journey. Introducing Yamaha's latest terrain-conquering side-by-side that combines thrilling power with maximum comfort and versatility. The all-new Wolverine R-Max 41000. It's an off-road game-changer. Check it out now at YamahaMotorsports.com and see your local Yamaha dealer today. Always protect the environment and wear your seatbelt, helmet, eye protection, and protective clothing. Read the owner's manual and product warning labels before operation.
La aventura tiene un nuevo nombre, Nissan Rogue Rock Creek. Con la Rogue Rock Creek estarás listo para conquistar el camino que venga. Si es una ruta rocosa, tienes llantas todoterreno. Ante una gran bajada, control para descenso inclinado y su parrilla tubular para techo, lista para lo que necesites. Cuando la vida te ofrece aventura, tú tienes la Nissan Rogue Rock Creek. La capacidad de carga está limitada por el peso y la distribución. Siempre asegure la carga. Cargar el vehículo con mucho peso, especialmente en el techo, afectará el manejo y la estabilidad del vehículo.
Green in 1988, 91 Out of Time, 92 Automatic for the People, 94 Monster, and then the next was 96's New Adventures in Hi-Fi.
And New Adventures was seen as a disappointment because it only sold like 3 million copies. Which was like, it's sort of like, it's like,
that's an interesting because now a lot of fans say that's their best. A lot of people, that interesting. That album, I got to go back and listen to it again because I admit I didn't connect with as much as the others, but I was just listening to some of the songs the other day and it's really good stuff. They kind of went in a different direction, tried some different things. Yeah, that was their last with Bill Berry, who left the band amicably the following year. The band members say that's R.E.M. at their peak. Do you agree?
Well, everybody hears things differently. The thing about R.E.M., of course it is. It's hugely subjective. I think that, it's not my favorite of their records. It's got a bunch of great songs on it, but it was kind of they made it in a cool way. A lot of those songs were written and at least partially recorded on the road, at sound checks. They, they hit their absolute popular apex in like 94, 95, in the wake of Out of Time and then Automatic for the People, which were both huge smashes, which they didn't tour for. They hadn't toured for half a dozen years, and they decided to do this huge global tour in 95. And starting, moving into that tour, if you remember, I remember at the time, I was sort of me at the peak of my R.E.M. fandom as well. It was almost as if the Beatles were going out on the road. The level of attention, that went into it, and the lines to get tickets, and, the size of the venues that they were playing all around the world, and the amount of it, the attention that they were getting and the focus. And it was like the tour where, they'd fly into some town and there'd be people, fans in the airport, there'd be people lined up across the street from the hotel when they got there.
Alternative rock radio became huge in the mid 90s. And so suddenly now REM is huge on alternative rock radio. So top 40 radio, rock radio, alternative rock. I remember that Monster album, just hit after hit after hit on all of those albums. They just were everywhere.
And it was a time, but of course, at the same time, you can't really underestimate the fact that spotlight, when it gets that strong, it kind of burns you a little bit. Just the amount of attention and the amount of focus. Before they could go from town to town, they'd play the local basketball arena or whatever on the Green Tour. But, before the show, after the show, they could just walk, put on their coats and walk out. And people, to the extent that they were recognized, would leave them alone. Or just say, hey. Whereas when you get to be as huge as they were by the time the mid-90s rolled around, the pressure of that level of fame is just off the charts. And I think that, people go like, well, they asked to be famous. And it's like, well, they wanted people to pay attention to the music. They wanted their music to be heard. They didn't personally want to be famous. You don't necessarily, just because you want your work to be known, doesn't mean you want people coming up to you in the produce aisle of the grocery store wanting to talk, oh my God, I love you so much. On any given day, you're not, you're just not in the mood, you're not in the mood to talk to your best friend, let alone strangers who want to take a picture or ask you things or tell you about themselves or hand you their demo or whatever.
Well, I think that's what happened with Kurt Cobain, right? Kurt Cobain probably felt the same way.
Absolutely. And the difference between Cobain's experience and Nirvana's experience and REM's experience was that REM had 10 years before, being together and touring before they became mega successful.
Yeah.
Nirvana had a matter of months.
Right.
Really. The time between when they were just playing mossy basement clubs around Olympia and Seattle and being at the absolute top of the heap was 20 months.
Insane.
Was it that much? It was their first major label record that just exploded. And it wasn't just one top 10 hit. Yeah. It was kablamo and all the power of MTV and all that stuff. And they were global celebrity / superstars before they had, it's like getting the bends, it's like, how do you deal with that? And if you're somebody like Cobain, who came into it already probably with, a tendency toward depression, to say nothing of, the drug use that probably was him self-medicating for his psychiatric issues, and meanwhile, suddenly you're at the epicenter of a huge industry.
Author Robert Boyd put a book out on Nirvana. Just had him put the episode just now. We were talking about that. Literally, like in September of 91, they're playing basements, like cellar basements, where the ceiling's hitting their heads. It's so small. And then 2 months later, it's like everywhere. So yeah, you're right. REM had that time to build up to, and I think they might have even been in their 30s by the time those albums really hit big for REM.
Michael was in his late 20s by the time they began to have like hit singles and stuff, and the other guys were a little bit older. But by the time you get to be that age, in your late 20s, you've been around for a while, and they've been touring, and they had gotten to know, to the extent that Michael ever had an existential crisis over becoming famous, what would have been in 85 when Fables of the Reconstruction came out, or they were making it at first, and then it was coming out, and you can kind of see he's talked about going through this period of depression and feeling really unsure of what he was doing or why he was doing it and why these people were looking at him like that and why people were, and you can sort of see this interesting process that he goes through between like the early spring of 85, and he's wearing dark glasses and a heavy overcoat on stage, and he's got this big floppy hat. And by the time they get to the Rock Palace TV show that they recorded in Germany in the fall, and suddenly he just looks so much more at ease. And he's described, trying to kind of think through his problems and sort of think through what his conundrum was at the time, and having kind of just the fog break and the sun kind of come through again and feel like suddenly realize who he was and what he was doing and why, and just feeling this palpable sense of relief. And by the time you start seeing, the videos from that show, that German TV show, it's like suddenly he's, and then by the time 86, 87 and beyond, you see him, the clips of them on stage. And this guy is so magnetic and such a powerful performer. It's unbelievable.
Did you hear the interview he did with Rick Rubin, Broken Record podcast? It was a year or two ago, just kind of out of nowhere. And I was so looking forward to it. It was a great interview. But one of the things he talks about in there, how he loves his life now because he's been out of the spotlight so long. He can go on the street. He can go to the store. Not everybody's going to recognize him.
But the thing about Michael is that he was one of those guys who knew how to, even during the Monster Tour, the way he got his exercise during the day was he would just put on a hat and pull it low over his eyes and just walk out of the hotel and take a walk around town. And people would just sort of think like, oh, that guy looks a little like Michael Stipe. But nobody would believe that this guy who's on the cover of all the magazines and is on MTV all the time is actually just walking around, taking a hike through town. And that's exactly what he was doing.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Don't go away, gentlemen. We may need all of you.
Life's an adventure. Share the journey. Introducing Yamaha's latest terrain-conquering side-by-side that combines thrilling power with maximum comfort and versatility. The all-new Wolverine R-Max 41000. It's an off-road game-changer. Check it out now at YamahaMotorsports.com and see your local Yamaha dealer today. Always protect the environment and wear your seatbelt, helmet, eye protection, and protective clothing. Read the owner's manual and product warning labels before operation.
La aventura tiene un nuevo nombre, Nissan Rogue Rock Creek. Con la Rogue Rock Creek estarás listo para conquistar el camino que venga. Si es una ruta rocosa, tienes llantas todoterreno. Ante una gran bajada, control para descenso inclinado y su parrilla tubular para techo, lista para lo que necesites. Cuando la vida te ofrece aventura, tú tienes la Nissan Rogue Rock Creek. La capacidad de carga está limitada por el peso y la distribución. Siempre asegure la carga. Cargar el vehículo con mucho peso, especialmente en el techo, afectará el manejo y la estabilidad del vehículo.
You do mention Michael and Mike Mills fell into fame more easily, whereas Bill felt a little sense of guilt, and Peter really retreated into himself, right, in the 90s.
Yeah, it's interesting because Peter was the guy in the early days who, when they were doing, they did a ton of media in the early days. They would talk to anybody, really, just to get the message out. And Peter was often like the first go-to interview guy. He was the most enthusiastic because he had spent so much time reading interviews of other rock stars that he just knew exactly how it was done. And was probably eager to be on the other side of the microphone, the other side of the camera for a while and just experience that. And he was also particularly good at kind of channeling what their message was, what they were about, what they were trying to do. And so you could sort of see him working so hard to get famous, and in a way, Bill Berry was exactly the same way. Bill, the drummer in the band, but was the one guy who had experience in the music industry before the band came together, not just being in a cover band with Mike Mills as a teenager, but he had also gotten a job as an office boy at this booking agency in Macon, where Ian Copeland, the brother of Miles Copeland, who owned, and founded IRS Records, and also the brother of Stuart Copeland, the drummer in the Police, quite a family. Ian was working at this Paragon booking agency in Macon, and Bill got a job there as a high school kid just to do whatever needed to be done around the office and chauffeur musicians when they came to town from place to place. But he was, when they first began to come together in that, in that church in 1980, and then think about playing shows elsewhere, he went back to Paragon and talked to his old friends who worked there and came away with a list of like all these different clubs in the Southeast, the names of the bookers, and knew exactly how you get a show at these clubs all over the place. And so could go very quickly from being a basement band playing parties for their friends to being a working professional band, because he knew what the requirements were. And both he and Peter were very good at sort of, creating that structure, understanding the workings of it and how to make it happen and do the labor day in and out, not just on stage, but the stuff that leads you onto the stage and then away from the stage to the next stage. But both of them were the ones who, as the band became bigger and more successful, felt most alienated from that experience. And I think Bill's problem was he loved the music, he loved playing music, he loved making records and writing and playing with his friends. But what he didn't love was every other aspect. Didn't like the travel, didn't like the interviews, didn't like the photo shoots, the video shoots, all that stuff. Peter, I think, just got exhausted. And I think that he, having achieved the great ambition in his life, to become a famous working, musician and rock star. Once he got there, he realized like, this is actually kind of we went too far. This is becoming a drag. It's like all this other stuff. And so Bill suffered this incredible thing of, in that tour in Europe when they were playing Lausanne, Switzerland in March of 1995, had an aneurysm on stage. So it's kind of like, if you're thinking of it in over dramatic figurative terms, the man's head exploded on stage, while they're at the peak of their fame, in the middle of a show, and had to be taken off stage and then eventually to a hospital where, luck being what it was and good fortune, it turned out, it was the hospital where the world's most sophisticated brain surgeons worked. And they figured out very quickly he'd had this aneurysm, and they knew exactly how to treat it, because they had just developed a new way of healing these things. And so he went from this extremely terrifying, life-threatening thing to had it fixed and rested up for 6 weeks and was back on the road and played the rest of the tour.
Yeah, they recorded one more album. But you break it down in the book. He actually finished the song "Man on the Moon" when that happened.
Yeah.
I mean, then he's keeling over, and the guys are in the band are like, whoa. I mean, at first they weren't sure what was up, but then they realized, something's up. But that did. I always thought that he left the band for health concerns, as a result of the aneurysm. But it's really more of like, some feel that kind of that scared him. Like I'm not going back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a lot of interpretations. Like, was there a physical result? Like, did it rewire his brain in some ways?
Or is he just reassessing life, just saying,
and there's that too. It's kind of like he'd always been more of a homebody, and he was very drawn to the idea of just living on a farm and working on a farm. And I think by that point, he'd been in this band for 14, 15 years, 16 years, 17 years, and they had made a ton of money, I mean, and I think it's like, man, I've traveled around the world multiple times. I've played all these shows. I've made all these records. What else is there to do other than to repeat ourselves? And it feels dangerous out there, and I don't like it. It's like, I want this band to continue because I love my friends and I love the music that they make, and I don't want them to stop. But I just don't feel like I can be a part of it because I don't enjoy it anymore. It's like this whole process.
A farmer. When became a farmer.
Yes. He did, and he hangs out and he plays music with his friends, and he's got a whole setup in his basement, and he hangs out around Athens, and he does that. I mean, it's interesting to see that they, all four guys in the wake of R.E.M. just kind of went back to doing what they always really wanted to do. Michael is super involved in visual art, making photographs, going around the world to see art exhibits and hang out, and he has a really active and fun Instagram account where he posts photos that he makes around various places that he goes, sees music, sees theater, sees art. Great life. Peter Buck lives in Portland, where I was living until recently, with Scott McCoy, who was the sort of R.E.M's utility musician for the second half of their career. Those guys are like peas in a pod. They co-produce records, and he just plays shows. He just plays in bars.
Yeah, didn't Peter start his own band?
Peter and Scott have started half a dozen bands at least. Yeah, Peter's and they're always, they just go from band to band. I mean, Scott's band, the -5, like Peter's a key member of that. It's kind of a conceptual band. It's whoever's around, Peter's often playing bass or second guitar. There's an array of other bands that they have. They produce records for people. So, everyone from Alejandro Escovedo to the Jayhawks and when those people come through town sometimes, or if they're going to go on the road, he'll play, they'll just join the band and go tour around. And he spent this fall, and maybe he'll be there for the winter down in Brazil playing with this guy, and he was telling me like, this guy's like the greatest in the world now, So he's producing this guy's records and playing in his band in South America. And Mike Mills is just kind of this gentleman golfer. He plays music, and works with a friend of his that he grew up with who's a classical violinist, and they do these kind of quasi-classical things and do all kinds of things in and around Georgia.
Sounds like they're all happy.
And Mike and Peter and Scott and a bunch of other people are in this band called the Baseball Project, and they just do concept albums about baseball and then tour around during the summer, and play in minor league parks or whatever. And
they're financially set. They're doing what they want. That's great to hear. I just wonder, does Michael sometimes get the itch? Does he have lyrics to come to him, and then he thinks, boy, I'd like to. I was hoping maybe he'd do a solo project or something like that.
He's working on one.
He is. Okay.
Yeah, he had a few. He's been talking about it for a few years, and he's released a few of the songs that he's been working on. So if you go on Spotify or wherever, you can hear him. They're around. And he's been saying, yeah, I'm working on a solo record, and it'll be done when it's done. Okay. So he works on it when he feels like it, and when he doesn't feel like it, he does whatever else he does feel like at that moment.
It's a beautiful thing. Beautiful thing.
It is.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
The suspense is killing me.
Life's an adventure. Share the journey. Introducing Yamaha's latest terrain-conquering side-by-side that combines thrilling power with maximum comfort and versatility. The all-new Wolverine R-Max 41000. It's an off-road game changer. Check it out now at YamahaMotorsports.com and see your local Yamaha dealer today. Always protect the environment and wear your seatbelt, helmet, eye protection, and protective clothing. Read the owner's manual and product warning labels before operation.
Recently, a new client called me and started by saying, "Mr. Morgan, I really need your help, but I'm just a nobody." Those words stunned me, and I immediately called him back, and we're now helping him and his family after a terrible accident. I'm John Morgan of Morgan & Morgan. Everybody who comes to our firm at their time of need is a somebody. I grew up poor, but my grandmother was like a queen to us. At Morgan & Morgan, our goal is to level the playing field for you and your family at your time of need. The insurance company has unlimited money and resources. You need a firm who can fight them toe-to-toe. For right at 30 years, we have fought them in courtrooms throughout America. Our results speak for themselves. And always remember this: everybody is a somebody, and nobody is a nobody. Visit forthepeople.com to learn about our firm. Morgan & Morgan, for the people.
Injured? Visit forthepeople.com for an office near you.
So the post-Bill Berry years, I thought they put out some great stuff, but you say the three members no longer spoke the same language, and the recordings were slow and painful. Those last 5 albums, Up, Reveal, Around the Sun, Accelerate, Collapse Into Now, they sold below expectations. How much do you feel that had to do with Bill's absence, or maybe it was just, they hit their 40s into their 50s and maybe
I think it's hard
course.
Careers kind of go like that, especially in pop music. It's kind of, especially in a band, which is about chemistry and about sort of everybody being on the same page and being drawn to the same type of stuff, So when Bill left in 97, I think, they were just starting work on their next record, which was eventually Up. It came out, was it in 98, I guess. Bill leaving the band and urging them to stay together, they had to relearn how to be a band because they're used to this four-man kind of chemistry and how their various skills and talents kind of wove together. Now they had to figure out a new sort of balance between the three of them. And Bill had always kind of functioned in some ways as a kind of the editor-in-chief for the band and had been very much, he brought in a lot of original music and was primarily responsible for like the chord progression for the
Oh, I
verse
didn't know
in
that.
Man on the Moon. He wrote all the music for Everybody Hurts, wrote like a
Well, that
lot of the chord
explains a
progressions.
lot then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And also he
Yeah.
was the guy that everybody trusted. So people would come in with their own little bits and pieces and he'd say, nah, that's going on too long. You got to cut that down, or we can't go. That's cool, but don't take it over there. And
Almost like a
for whatever
producer.
reason, yeah, he was kind of the guy who everybody trusted to tell them when they were getting a little too far out of line and helped kind of weave it together. So without him, they had to figure out a new way to do that. So I think the working process for Up was harder. That was the one where they had trouble communicating. And then they kind of figured out who they were as a trio. And then it became a little easier. But, you sort of go from record to record. And after you've done it 10, 12 times, and you've been in a band for more than 20 years, keeping it fresh, and keeping it, and also keeping your thumb on the pulse of the culture is something, kind of comes in and out of focus. And that happens for every artist who has a long-term career. Sometimes it seems like you're channeling something that everybody can grasp. And sometimes they have no idea what you're talking about, or their eyes and ears are focused in a different direction. And so it's inevitable that some of your work is going to be accepted, and consumed at a higher level than other moments. But
Right.
all those records in the the 21st century REM records, each one of them has, even the worst of them, generally by and large, people, I think Around the Sun is the one that certainly the people in the band felt like didn't work out as well as they would have hoped, and critically was probably the most beat up upon because it's the sleekest. It just doesn't seem to have the, aspects of it just felt like they overworked it to some degree. But on the other hand, it's got like great songs, I mean, maybe they could have recorded them better, or maybe those songs are a little over fussed with or something. But, right after that, they made this really raw, hard rocking album called Accelerate, which is just like, it sounds like, they could have, and they recorded that in like 3 weeks, just pounded it out. And basically the marching orders they gave themselves when they came in is, we're not going to screw around with this, and we're not going to put a lot of keyboards on this. This is going to be raw, urgent rock and roll that's going to come out, and we're not going to fool with it. We're going to get this on tape and we're going to release it. Bang. And that's what they did. And it's a great record.
That's the one with Supernatural,
super serious.
Super serious. Up has some great stuff on there too. There was always something from each album. Oh My Heart, which was about Hurricane Katrina. Just thought it was a beautiful song. I can't remember which one that's off of, but
I think it's on the last one. That's on Collapse Into Now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Day Sleeper and Lotus from what I thought was interesting. There's that Beach Boys Pet Sounds song, At My Most Beautiful.
Right.
Off of Up. Yeah. So they kept it a secret for more than a year, but then in 2011 they announced it was over. No final tour, no climactic performance to pay tribute to their fans or their career. How did you feel about that? Surprised?
No, not surprised at all. I would have been surprised if they had done the big farewell tour because, again, I mean, R.E.M. begins, it's like the first line in the first, the prologue of the book is like, even from the start, you would know them by their refusals. And there's this litany of things that all the other bands do. They're sort of pro forma for rock bands and rock musicians that they were like, no, we're not doing that. We're not gonna lip sync in our videos. They had rules, and every so often they would evolve away or change their mind and find a way to do stuff like print the lyrics or mix the vocal so you could hear what he was saying, or lip sync in the videos when they figured out how to do it in a way that felt artistic to them. And so, when they broke up, what they said was, we are not going to get back together. It's like, unlike every other band, like that breaks up and then eventually finds a way to reunite. I mean, look at Oasis, right? I mean, and those guys hated each other. Huge fights, couldn't stand each other, trash talked each other to the moon for 14 years before they finally figured out that it was time to get back together. R.E.M. went out the same way they went in, with hugs and friendship and mutual affection and support and respect, and have never faltered in that, And yet, so you'd think that a band that was that closely allied artistically and personally, even if they'd gotten to the end of what felt like, the natural lifespan of their collaboration, that at some point 10, 15 years later, they'd go, you know what? It'd be fun, and like, plus also every year, they get a different crop of hugely lucrative reunion offers. Come play Coachella, come play this festival, come play that festival. We'll pay you to the moon. Somebody described it to me as generational money. People come in and they're like, we will give you, and plus also that's just the beginning of the summer long reunion tour, right? So you go off and you tour for 3 months, or maybe you go around the world and you tour for 6 months, and you come home with $50 million or something like that. And it's like, boom, that's it. You're sending, it's not only your kids who are going to college, it's their kids and their kids and every kid in town, you could send to college if you wanted to.
Yeah. And just from the aspect of the legacy of the band too, I somewhat selfishly, I just feel like I wish that they were out there continuing so they can get new generations of fans, because I don't know how many of the younger fans now know that much about R.E.M. And it's like, you don't know, this is a band with had a huge impact on the history of rock and roll. And then you think about the songs. I mean, if they played a show, they could probably fill 3 hours with just songs that were on the radio that everybody knows.
Yeah, and then come out and play a whole other 3-hour show the next night and do the same thing. I mean, it's just like, there's certain bands, and certain artists who are so accomplished and have written, had long careers where they've made so much great work, that it's like, and I could think of a few. It's like, and a lot of them are still out there for one reason or the other. I mean, think of Paul McCartney or Bruce Springsteen or Dylan or the Stones. I mean, the Stones come out and play. I mean, I don't think that the Stones have really made a great record since 1978, but the records that they made between 1963 and 1978, you could do 3 straight nights of 2-hour shows and never repeat a song, and it would be amazing. McCartney could probably do that for a week. I mean, he could come out and just play his hits from the 70s.
Beatles
and it would be
solo,
a huge,
just solo.
No Beatles. You could do a whole night of Wings Wings songs, and R.E.M. could kind of do the same thing. They could play a whole night. They could play an entire show of songs that they only recorded for IRS before Green, before Out of Time, and it would be a huge night full of hit after hit. A lot of them are radio hits, a lot or whatever, or college radio hits or whatever, or songs that became popular subsequently. But it would be Driver 8, Radio Free Europe, Gardening at Night, Don't Go Back to Rockville, all the way up through The One I Love. But like End of the World as we know it, just hit after hit after hit. And none of them were on the Warner's records, and then just play it a whole, you could play 2 nights just made up of the first 5 albums from the Warner years. And then they could play a whole night of original songs from starting with the post Bill Berry years. And that's a whole other night of great songs that were, and a lot of those, they weren't hits in the US, but a lot of those songs off of Up and off of Reveal were smash hits in England. It's like if you go and you listen to the Glastonbury show that they played in '99, that was on the Up tour. It's fascinating for a couple reasons. One of them is that a lot of those songs that were super electronic on Up, and maybe harder for, your baseline R.E.M. fan to grasp, when they were playing them on stage with a more guitar-dominated lineup, it was like, oh, these are just great rock and roll songs. Like underneath the synthesizers and the layers of, electronica whooshing and whirring and mediated voices, it's like, this is just a kick-ass rock and roll song, There's that, but then there's also the fact that like when they start playing the intro of the song Day Sleeper, which is a great song, but nobody wanted to know about it in the US, but in England it was like a top 4 smash. And when they start playing the intro to that song, the place, all of Glastonbury explodes, in the same way that they exploded for the intro of The One I Love, like 2 songs earlier. So it's just like, oh, it's like where you were at the time. You know, they had, even in the first decade of the 21st century, when they were, you know, it was really hard for them to get on the radio, mainstream radio in the US suddenly. It's just hit after hit after hit after hit overseas.
Imitation of Life, right?
Great
All
song.
the Way to Reno is one of my favorite R.E.M. songs. Those
Sure.
are two right there from Reveal.
Or Lotus, you know,
Lotus,
Lotus,
yeah.
you know, that song, you know, I mean, it's just kind of like Smash or The Great Beyond, you know, the
Oh,
song that was in the Andy Kaufman in the Man on the Moon,
Man on the Moon.
a movie. It's like, you know, it got released here and people were like, it's like, I don't know if it made the top 40, but in England and in Europe, it was like, it was a top 5 hit.
I did not know that. Day Sleeper is a song, you know, that's the type of song that's a little more direct. He's telling a story. He's creating the story, but this poor guy, he's like, he doesn't even know why he's crying. He's just...
Yeah.
You know,
he's got this weird upside down life.
Right.
You know? He's so alienated from the rest of society because he works during the, you know, he's up at night and he sleeps during the day. And, you know, I mean, it's a metaphor, obviously, but it's like, but, you know, I mean, and obviously if you're a rock star, it's kind of, you know, it's your life too. They did such a good job of being super successful and super, you know, on every level, artistic, financial, the whole business, and still hanging on to their humanity, which is not, you know, which is the less familiar part of the rock star story. You know, people always talk about the rare story of the good guy finishing first, you know, and I mean, obviously, you know, in any business like being a rock star, anything that ends with wealth and fame, there's a lot of ambitious people hustling mightily hard to achieve things. And there's a certain amount of hard decisions and even ruthlessness that goes into becoming as big as R.E.M. became. And there certainly are, you know, even a small number of people who've been a part of R.E.M.'s story where they felt, you know, hard done by in some way, shape, or form. But by and large, it was really interesting to talk to a lot of people who had known and been involved with them over a very long career. And virtually all of them were like, yeah, no, ultimately they were decent guys who did the right thing.
The name of this band is R.E.M, a biography. It's out now. It's been out for a little while. You can find it wherever books are sold. Can people find you online, Peter, if they want to reach out to you?
Why, they sure can. They can. My website is just peteramescarlin.com. So toss my name in the Googler or your search engine of choice, and I should come rattling out of there.
I'd love to have you back on again. I was trying to get you on for your Warner Brothers book. I remember. I think I reached out to the publisher. I'd love to have you back on again, man. I'm a big fan of your work.
Well, thank you. Well, the next one's coming out next August already. So it's a book about, if you're interested in Bruce Springsteen, it's a deep dive, deep dive into the making of Born to Run. So that comes out on August 5th, just in time for the 50th anniversary of the album. So
looking very forward to that. Yeah, I'd love to have you back on for that. Peter Ames Carlin, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
That's it. It's in the books.
Life's an adventure. Share the journey. Introducing Yamaha's latest terrain-conquering side-by-side that combines thrilling power with maximum comfort and versatility. The all-new Wolverine R-Max 41000. It's an off-road game-changer. Check it out now at YamahaMotorsports.com and see your local Yamaha dealer today. Always protect the environment and wear your seatbelt, helmet, eye protection, and protective clothing. Read the owner's manual and product warning labels before operation.